all my friends are synths.
The Octatrack is an infamously idiosyncratic device, and as such one which demands that you pay it some proper attention and respect. It's an incredibly capable machine with lots of possibilities, but it can be difficult to gel with if you only just dabble around on the surface. Instead, you really need to sit down and invest some proper time and energy in order to understand it. For that reason, after a rather shameful 18 months worth of procrastination on my part, I've recently been making more of a conscious effort to focus on the Octatrack and get more comfortable with how it operates. There's still plenty of features that I haven't explored or quite got my head around yet, and I definitely do not claim to be some kind of Octatrack expert, not by any means. However, I've started to make some headway at least, and even actually enjoy making music with the thing. I know that there are lots of people out there that might be really intrigued by the idea of the Octatrack in theory, but also who might find it really difficult to understand how it can be used in practice. So in this video, I'm going to share with you one of the ways that I've been approaching actually putting tracks together, at least one that has worked for me, and specifically how I'm using scenes to do that. Before diving in, I'll start with a very quick overview of the Octatrack's basic functionality so that you know what I'm on about. If you already know all of this, then obviously feel free to skip ahead. I'm not going to be taking a register, there's not going to be a quiz at the end or anything like that. As the name suggests, the Octatrack has got 8 separate tracks which run concurrently. These tracks have each got a raft of different associated parameters, including the type of sample, various LFOs, 2 effects slots, and a bunch of other interesting ways to mangle your audio. The Electron approach to sequencing means that each track has got a default set of values, which can then be adjusted on a per step basis through what are called P-locks, and that includes the sample itself. This is where some of the magic lies, because it operates in a similar but not identical way to a tracker, giving you quite a lot of granular control. One of the most powerful and interesting features of the Octatrack in particular is that you can create multiple different scenes, which are effectively collections of individual global adjustments to the default parameters that you choose. These scenes can then be selected on the fly using the 16-step keys at the bottom, or assigned to either of the A and B buttons on the right hand side, which you can then transition between using the crossfader, which is incredibly cool actually. Now you might notice that I am not mentioning features like parts or MIDI tracks or the recording buffers, and that is deliberate because even though there are lots of cool ways that you can use those, I haven't really felt the need to do so for this approach. And you don't need to deploy every single feature of the Octatrack all of the time in order for it to be worthwhile. That's one of the reasons that I think people end up just paralysed when it comes to using this thing, so make sure and avoid that particular trap if you can. One of the things that I like about collecting different bits of gear is that their strengths will naturally inform and ultimately vary the type of music that I make. So for example, with certain devices I find myself using a lot of one-shot samples. In the case of the Octatrack though, it's got a really powerful and straightforward time stretch functionality, which has led me to use a lot more loops. I'm completely sure that the quality of the time stretch algorithm in the Octatrack won't impress people that are used to Ableton or whatever, but in contrast to most of the hardware that I've got, the Octatrack makes it a breeze to dump in a whole pile of different samples and then squash or stretch or pitch them until they work nicely together, and then flip or chop or twist them into something of a cohesive composition. Because of this, I've actually started just recording all sorts of weird loops from my modular and other equipment with the knowledge that the Octatrack will let me put them together in a, a beautiful way. It's really, I like it. I do find the Octatrack a bit less naturally suited towards ultra complex arrangements than something like the Dirty Wave M8 is, at least for how my brain works anyway. Instead though, I feel like the Octatrack really encourages you to get hands-on and perform or play with the audio through the use of scenes in a really satisfying way. So my approach has generally been to create foundational patterns out of mangled loops, which are then interspersed and layered with a collection of one-shots, all using the power of P-locks and trigless trigs and all that kind of stuff. From there, the sounds are evolved and kept interesting by transitioning between various scenes as I work through the song's patterns, as it were. From my perspective, this approach produces results which are really pleasing to sit, not just listen to, but also interact with as a musician, and it's quite different in some ways to how I write with other devices, which I think is a good thing. After I had written a few bits of music with the Octatrack in this way, I realised that in order to get the most out of it, I was going to have to adopt some kind of standardised approach. Otherwise, I had no idea what type of effect was associated with what scene number, or what tracks I could mute at a glance, which made the performative side of things far more difficult. The results of this are evident by the masking tape which I've got stuck on there with my kind of chicken scratch scribbling. The first thing that I wanted to do was have some idea of what kind of sample would generally be in each track slot. This didn't need to be a strict rule, and it's not intended to box me into specific instrumentation, but rather I wanted to at least map out some of the common elements and make things easier to navigate. So for example, for this approach, I've regularly been using drum loops, which I keep in track 1. Track 2 has got drum reinforcements, whether that's extra rhythmical loops or one-shots or whatever. Track 3 is some kind of bass part. Tracks 4 and 5 are melodic parts. 6 and 7 are effects or additional pieces. And track 8 is where vocal samples would usually go. Again, this doesn't prevent me from throwing in different samples with P-locks or adding in additional melody lines or whatever. It just helps to make things a bit clearer and have a rough consistency for the common elements. Whilst I find it useful to lay out tracks in this manner, something that is far more practically important is to clearly mark out what your specific scenes are going to affect, so that you know what's going to happen when you slide that fader over to one side or the other. As you can hopefully see, I've grouped my scenes into different collections. I've got a totally dry scene, 3 that are dedicated for drums, 3 for the first melody part, 2 for the next melody part, 2 for each of the 3 additional effects layers, and then 1 kind of wild card at the end. Initially, I started to be much more detailed about what effects the scenes would include, such as specifically noting that, I don't know, scene 3 would be a lo-fi effect on the drums, for example, or that scene 5 would be a high-pass filter on melody 2. However, I found that quickly became overly prescriptive, and that kind of granularity wasn't actually required. What mattered most was knowing what part of the arrangement I was going to impact, rather than the specifics of each effect. With that said, I do still try and follow some kind of convention, right? And that time-based effects like delays will sit in the last slot of the section, whereas fuzzes or whatever will be in the earlier ones, which does give some element of predictability. But by grouping things in this way, it means that rather than forcing myself into a rigid box, I still have the freedom to change up the effects I'm using to suit the music or the part, which is ultimately the most important thing. One of the common bits of advice that you hear for using the Octatrack is to create templates for different use cases. And I debated doing that for this particular setup, but I realised that it just wasn't necessary. And just like trying to get granular about the specific type of effects with the scenes, it would actually probably be overly restrictive in the end, so I didn't bother with that. Using this method has really kind of supercharged my ability to write music in the Octatrack and feel much more comfortable performing it. It allows me to get much more consistent, pleasing results, as opposed to having to guess or relearn everything every time I use it. I know that some people will be turned off by the idea of, applying a system like this, as it might seem like you're limiting yourself to certain options, but it's important to remember that you don't have to stick to these guidelines. At any point I can just rip the tape off, or even just load a new project and try something else. The Octatrack does so much though that thinking about things in this kind of standardised way can help. And you could easily have multiple different sets of approaches depending on what you want to achieve. It just kind of makes things simpler in a way. This gives you an idea of at least one way in which the Octatrack can be used in practice to actually make music, or spark some ideas of different ways that perhaps you can approach and standardise things for yourself. If you do have Octatrack suggestions or tips, please do leave them below. This might be a cynical attempt to get you to engage with the video, but actually it is a dense topic and there's so much to learn that I very much welcome hearing about other people's experiences. I've been kicking about, the Electronauts forum and all that kind of stuff to try and soak up everything I can. I'm going to keep digging in, and perhaps one day I'll look at those bloody recording buffers.
A waste of time and a waste of your life.